mission, which is to foster a secular society based on science, reason, freedom of inquiry, and humanistic values, I thought, now here is everything I value and support, and everything dogmatic people devalue and oppose. So I was delighted to learn there is such an agency, and I'm really happy to be here. It's good to know that you, and hopefully myself, are eagerly trying to open our minds, our own minds, about those that are closed. So why is it, do you think, that some people's minds are like the bed in their guest room? Always made up, seldom used. And how do we know if someone is just being opinionated versus being dogmatic? Well, these are the questions I asked throughout my studies in graduate school. And both my thesis in the master's level and my doctoral dissertation focused on the measurement of dogmatism. And it was only after that that I began to inquire about a theory. Hopefully, there was a comprehensive theory out there that gave a little more explanation about the features of dogmatism and its developmental origins. And there was nothing forthcoming, so I decided, having studied the area, that I would develop my own theory and my own taxonomy of features, which I did then in my book, which Lauren talked about. So it all began with a serendipitous find in a secondhand bookstore. Years ago, I stumbled upon Milton Rokeach's book, The Open and Closed Mind, and I was so fascinated by it. And to this day, many years later, I continue to think a lot about dogmatism, my own tendencies too, because all of us sometimes have a tendency, especially if we're a little anxious or feeling a bit emotionally attached to an idea, we have a tendency to narrow our thinking a bit. So my theory, it draws from a number of disciplines in the field, mainly psychology, but personality theory, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, social psychology, cognitive psychology, anthropology, biopsychology. But it needs, despite the research that I've put into the ideas behind it, my theory really needs empirical validation. As it stands, I think it's simply a reasonable theory at this time. So we've all known people who are commonly described as pig-headed or hidebound, or rednecks who never met a bigot they don't like. And these people, they act as if they're the sole expert on a topic, or every topic. And they simply refuse to see things any other way because in their minds, they have nailed truth to the mat. As Churchill said, they won't change their minds and they won't change the topic. Well, there are degrees of dogmatism, and the mildest form is the adamant voice of I'm right, you're wrong. A more moderate variation is I'm right, you're stupid. But extreme dogmatism, this is where the danger lies. Extreme dogmatism is the voice that rages, I'm right, you're dead. So let's look at some definitions now, and these are borrowed from Oxford and Webster. I didn't go into the details of referencing every one of those particular quotes. I'll let you read this on your own, just to get a feel for the dictionary definition. So over time, and with repetition, myths and narratives become the dogma of belief systems, which, if they are then widespread and institutionalized, become known as ideological systems, about which people can be very passionate. So ideology, to quote E.O. Wilson, is simply dogma writ large. And my definition has been fine-tuned over the years, and it attempts to capture the entire suite of dogmatism's psychological features, and I'll let you read that slowly on your own. So you'll see that I've emphasized their personality trait. And that is to emphasize that dogmatism is a pattern of behaviors that endure across time and across different situations. And as trait theorists note, traits anchor an upper and a lower end of a continuum on a measure of a particular trait. So because they're fairly stable across time and situation, we are not, for example, extroverted on Monday and introverted on Wednesday, any more than we're likely to be open-minded on Tuesday and closed-minded on Thursday. So the research into trait stability, which is done largely by Costa and McRae, if there are any psychologists who have studied trait theory, others as well, of course, but they suggest that trait stability pretty much is in place at the age of 30. And so if we're really dogmatic, and think now of how dogmatism anchors more the extreme end of a scale, if we're dogmatic at 35, it's very difficult to jump out of our cognitive ruts. And someone asked me last year, I was giving a talk in Cambridge, and they asked me, and he was quite fervent about this, but shouldn't we be dogmatic about some things? Now good questions are always the most difficult to answer. And that is a very good question. It gets at the nitty-gritty of my own struggle with dogmatism. Are there times? And I say, yes, we should be passionate about certain ideas and beliefs. Dogmatic, no. And you'll get a sense of why I say no to dogmatism on everything as we go through this. But passionate, open-minded believers have reasoned beliefs with flexible boundaries. They have liberal beliefs, more unconventional attitudes. They're insightful, they're more imaginative, have a curious mind, and they can tolerate differences. They're all of you. Dogmatism is, of course, a very different matter. So I want to look very briefly, and this will be briefly, at the innate childhood needs that Rokeach and I have added to this, assume that all humans have. And Rokeach started off with these two, a need to defend against anxiety and a need to know. And he maintained that we are all born with an innate need to know ourselves, others, and the world around us. But we're also born with a need to defend against anxiety because we're small and we're helpless and we're inexperienced. We haven't developed intellectually. And the extent to which we need to defend against anxiety prevails, the more the need to know becomes constricted and compromised. Rokeach wrote about that in 1960. I stumbled upon his book in the mid-70s, found that there still really wasn't much done on dogmatism other than people who used his measurement scale to test various aspects of it. But there was no theory about it. And I began to think, well, this is very good. The need to know and the need to defend against anxiety, it's very simple, it's very to the point, it's also very Freudian. And in Rokeach's book, he only spent 2 or 3 paragraphs defining dogmatism as a Freudian defense mechanism, which at the time made sense because Freud was still, a towering giant in terms of psychological theory. But I decided to add an innate need for social connection as a third need, upon which the need for dignity depends. So I see dogmatism as a mistaken solution to unfulfilled needs. And I'll have more to say about the psychological and social, cultural, systemic influences that jeopardize these needs. But first, let's consider its subtraits. This is arbitrary. I've thought about this and changed it a lot, and it's a work in process. You can feel free to add to it. Write to my blog on dog at dogmatism.ca. Give me your ideas. I've come up with 13 subtraits or features or characteristics of dogmatism, 5 of which are cognitive, 3 emotional, 5 behavioral, and I've assumed that 6 are necessary to determine trait presence. So you'll be familiar now with quite a few of these, but up until now they've sort of hung together loosely. So let's begin with the cognitive features. The first one is an intolerance of ambiguity. So there's an example there. This is Budner's definition, the persistent tendency to perceive ambiguous information in situations as sources of threat. So an example of a comment that we might see there. How all of us cope with ambiguity affects our perceptions, affects our interpretations of events and situations, but it also influences the extent to which we value cognitive effort. To cope with threatening uncertainty, dogmatic people rigidly cling to absolute truth because it removes ambiguity and it reduces anxiety. Ambiguity intensifies anxiety, which is the engine of dogmatism, and fear puts it in overdrive. The next feature is defensive cognitive closure, which is a consequence of an intolerance of anxiety. When new ideas threaten their existing truths, dogmatic people, what they tend to do is manage the discomfort by immediately judging and dismissing anything that conflicts with those truths. It's patently ridiculous or just flat wrong. And it isn't that they have psychological or cognitive inertia, or that they can't do the serious work of thinking. That is not why I think they close their minds. They close their minds prematurely to remove ambiguity, to reduce anxiety, and to convince others that they are right, indisputably right. So all 3 of those reinforce their egos, their safety, and their certainty, which brings us to the third cognitive trait. Rigid certainty. This is from Bob Altemeyer's book, in which if you can see it there, The Authoritarian Spectre. It's a wonderful book. He's a prof at University of Manitoba. His work is published by Harvard. And John Yost of New York University, if any of you are from New York, John and I did a PBS interview on the radio station, and John is working on intolerance of ambiguity and political orientation. He's doing some fascinating work. Those are John Yost and Bob Altemeyer are 2 of the leading figures in this area. The litmus test for rigid certainty is the answer to this question, and you could try asking someone this if you think they're really dogmatic about an issue. What kind of evidence would it take for you to change your mind? And I think we know what their answer is likely to be if they're really dogmatic, because rarely will they acknowledge that they're mistaken, even when they're presented with convincing contradictory evidence that would give reasonable people pause. Abandoning their rigid certainty means that they'd have to tolerate ambiguity, and they'd have to open their minds to the possibility that they might be wrong. And that threatens too much need. The need to be absolutely, unequivocally, indubitably right.